Tyrannosaurus rex, the most famous dinosaur of all and an iconic prehistoric animal that's known the world over, has been at the heart of its fair share of controversies. Paleontologists, the scientists who study prehistoric life, love nothing more than to argue about the biology and life appearance of this animal. Well, actually, they might love arguing about Spinosaurus a little bit more. The extent of feathering in T-Rex, whether or not it had lips, and how beefy this animal was are all topics that have been discussed a great deal by scientists and dinosaur fans alike. These debates might seem somewhat pointless in the grand scheme of things, but they're actually all very interesting biological questions, and answering them can tell us a lot about the lifestyles and evolution of these magnificent extinct animals. A few years ago, I made a video discussing what, at that time, I thought was a pretty good contender for the most up-to-date, accurate depiction of a Tyrannosaurus rex that had ever been reconstructed. This was the Art of T-Rex, done as the basis for the model used in the video game Saurian. This game aimed to reconstruct an accurate simulation of the Hell Creek paleo-environment where T-Rex lived, and to have players be able to play as a dinosaur as they grew from a hatchling to an adult. This depiction shows Tyrannosaurus as a mostly featherless animal with a few sparse filaments here and there, with lips on its jaws, and as an overall pretty robust animal with a good deal of meat on its bones. In all fairness, this depiction of the Tyrant King has held up pretty well over the last few years, and there haven't been too many dramatic changes in what we understand about the look of this iconic dinosaur. However, I do think we now have a new contender for the most accurate depiction of Tyrannosaurus ever made. And the best thing about this is that it's a physical model that you can own. This is the EoFauna T-Rex model, and it's absolutely beautiful. As a serious nerd for accurate looking dinosaurs, I think this figure is just wonderful. There are so many details on this reconstruction that the creators have done a fantastic job of incorporating. So let's go through them. Why do I think this is the most accurate T-Rex ever reconstructed? Well, this EoFauna model is not just a generic T-Rex. This is a faithful reconstruction of the individual Tyrannosaurus specimen known as Sue, housed at the Field Museum in Chicago. Sue is the most complete T-Rex that's been found so far, and she's a particularly large one. So I'd argue that the fact this model depicts an individual Tyrannosaurus with all its specific dimensions and proportions is a good reason for making this the most accurate depiction of a T-Rex created so far. To be fair, we do live in a golden age for accurate T-Rex depictions, with lots of modern paleoart beautifully rendering these animals based on the latest science. We've had documentaries such as Prehistoric Planet with some incredible looking tyrannosaurs too. I might also review the accuracy of those reconstructions at some point in another video if people would like that. But the EoFauna model really is a very strong contender for being the most accurate so far. The overall coloration of this model is very reminiscent of certain monitor lizards, as well as modern crocodilians, with patterns of yellow and darker colours along the sides, a kind of disruptive coloration. Paired with the evident countershading, with a darker colour along the back giving way to the lighter underside, this seems like a good colour scheme for breaking up its outline, very useful for an ambush hunter. It's also just quite a unique coloration for a tyrannosaur that's a bit more interesting than a generic brown colour, but it's still realistic, although obviously entirely speculative, given how prevalent yellowish scale pigmentation is among modern reptiles. The colour pattern itself was actually developed by the amazing paleoartist Andrea Tuchin. Along the top surface of the neck, back, and all the way down the tail, there are also some feathery filaments. Now, again, this is speculative, but based on what we currently know about the distribution of feathers in Tyrannosaurus, this amount of feathering is entirely plausible. We know that earlier relatives of T-Rex definitely had feathers, such as the small basal tyrannosauroid D. long and the much larger U. tyrannus. So feathers were ancestral to the lineage leading to Tyrannosaurus itself. However, the few fossilized skin impressions that have been found from T-Rex show that this animal had small mosaic scales, at least in regions around the sides of the neck, in the hip area, and at the base of the tail. These are all regions reconstructed as scaly in the EoFauna model, while the speculative feather filaments are distributed further up the body, an entirely plausible combination of integument types for this animal. Also, where the model has scales, the shape and patterns of these structures are rendered in very impressive detail and closely match what the fossil imprints show, with many small, variably shaped and irregularly positioned scales. One of the other big debates surrounding reconstructions of the tyrant reptile king is of course whether or not these dinosaurs had lips. I've done a whole video on this controversy before, and you might think that surely this is a pretty ridiculous argument, and also, who really cares? But trust me, as someone who has personally spent far too long thinking about dinosaur lips, it's pretty interesting, and the presence or absence of these structures has a major impact on reconstructions of these animals, since lacking lips means the teeth of T-Rex would be exposed with the mouth closed, whereas lips would completely hide them. Well, the EoFauna model, as you can see, goes with the lipped version of T-Rex, which is indeed supported by the latest research. Although many older reconstructions show Tyrannosaurus with a more crocodilian style of soft tissue mouth anatomy, bearing their exposed teeth even with the mouth closed, paleontologists have compared the underlying bone structure of the jaws in theropod dinosaurs and crocodilians, and found many differences between them. Specifically, differences in the distribution of small openings in the bone, plus the overall bone texture, suggest that theropods such as Tyrannosaurs had quite different soft tissues to crocs. Instead of the cracked, keratinized skin that leaves the teeth open to the air, Tyrannosaurs likely had extended scaly lip tissues that covered the teeth, much more like what we see in modern lizards. These lips were still different from mammalian-style lips though, so they were not highly movable muscular structures. It might seem surprising that teeth the size of T-Rex's could actually be completely obscured by soft tissues, but researchers have also made comparisons to modern animals such as monitor lizards, which have proportionally enormous teeth for the size of their heads, which are entirely hidden when the mouth is closed. Incredibly, even when the mouth is open, it doesn't look like these lizards have particularly huge teeth, since they're buried in a lot of gum tissue. But take a look at their skulls, and you'll be amazed at the extent to which teeth can be hidden by soft tissues. So, looking at the EoFauna T-Rex model's mouth, you can see exactly this sort of soft tissue anatomy on display. The lips are very nicely reconstructed, with enlarged scales obvious along the edges, and when the mouth closes, the teeth are hidden. Inside the mouth, only the very tips of the teeth are poking out from the extensive gum tissue. The teeth do appear fairly rounded and a bit blunt, and in reality they should be a little sharper. But there are of course regulations that have to be followed in creating a model such as this so that there aren't super sharp bits on it. The arrangement of the teeth, with the much smaller teeth at the front of the upper jaw giving way to the massive longer ones further back, is also another very nice little detail. I'd also like to mention the anatomy of the tongue. Recent research has found that most theropod dinosaurs would actually have had rather immobile tongues that couldn't be raised much from the floor of the mouth, similar to what we see in modern crocodilians. This discovery is based on the study of fossilized hyoid bones, which anchor tongue musculature. Other kinds of dinosaurs probably did have more flexible tongues, but it seems theropods such as tyrannosaurs wouldn't have been able to stick them out dramatically as they vocalized, as is often shown in many reconstructions. So once again, the EoFauna model's depiction of the tongue sitting on the floor of the mouth is a great detail that's consistent with our current understanding. Another very nice little detail on the mouth interior is the presence of openings on the roof of the mouth, known as choanae, basically internal nostrils. Also, there are lots of little black speckles all over, representing hyperpigmentation where patches of the skin are darker. Just another nice little touch giving this model some interesting individuality. During the process of creating this model, the EoFauna scientists actually made an interesting observation regarding the soft tissue anatomy of the back of Tyrannosaurus's jaws. The anatomy of cheeks in dinosaurs has been the topic of another area of debate among paleontologists, and although it's clear they wouldn't have had supermuscular cheeks like mammals, the extent to which soft tissue covering would have been present at the back of the mouth is an interesting question. A lot of Tyrannosaurus reconstructions show a condition similar to modern lizards, in which there's a mandibular adductor muscle and then just the borders of the jaws, covered in the enlarged lip scales. However, when the EoFauna team tried to restore the amount of musculature that should be at the back of the jaw on T-Rex, they discovered that the outermost skin folding didn't have enough space to be contained. So rather than the lizard style of cheek anatomy, they suggest it's more likely T-Rex's outermost skin fold extended down from the jugal region under the eye and sort of backwards and across the rear end of the mouth, kind of like we see in living condors. This is therefore reflected in the model's anatomy, which shows this stretch of skin passing over the back of the jaws, giving it a more jowly sort of appearance. Moving to the lower hind limbs and feet, the model also incorporates details of scutate scales along the front and top surfaces. This type of scale is seen on the feet of modern birds and helps keep these parts of the feet protected as they walk about on the ground. There is actually some evidence for scutate scales having been present on the feet of non-bird theropod dinosaurs too, as fossil skin impressions from the species Concavenator, a kind of Carcharodontosaurid dinosaur found in Spain, clearly show the presence of these broader scales next to the bones of the foot. So, the fact that a Carcharodontosaurid such as Concavenator had an avian-style foot scale anatomy strongly indicates that these types of scales were widespread amongst theropod dinosaurs. Additionally, there's also a specimen of a small early tyrannosauroid called Santanaraptor that preserves direct evidence of so-called scutellate scales next to the toe bones, slightly smaller scales that probably surrounded the scutate scales. So the model includes these larger rectangular scales going down the feet and toes. The lower sides of the toes and the undersides are textured with many very small reticulate scales, again similar to what we see in living birds, and also what's preserved in various non-bird theropod dinosaur fossils. Very briefly, I also wanted to just mention the story of the lost mummified Tarbosaurus specimens. Tarbosaurus bata is a very close relative of Tyrannosaurus known from fossils found in Mongolia and China, and apparently back in the 90s, a couple of intriguing specimens were uncovered that showed evidence of soft tissue structures in these dinosaurs. One of these specimens apparently consisted of an almost complete Tarbosaurus skeleton preserving impressions of scales from many different regions of the body, and the other one was a badly weathered skull that displayed a wattle or bag of skin under the jaws. The paleontologist who reported this discovery further speculates that perhaps this bag of skin enabled large chunks of prey to be swallowed. It is also possible that the skin was a brightly coloured dewlap similar to that seen in some lizards today. Both these specimens are now sadly lost, seemingly stolen or perhaps eroded to dust in the desert. All that remains are these reports as well as a few photos of the whole body mummy. It's a real shame that these specimens have disappeared. It would be absolutely incredible to have this data on Tarbosaurus' life appearance. The alleged pouch underneath the jaw has inspired some paleoart, but without further confirmation or solid evidence that this is really what the fossil showed, including it in tyrannosaur reconstructions is still very speculative. Hopefully we'll find another Tarbosaurus fossil with soft tissue traces like this one day. Or who knows, maybe an entire mummified T-Rex. That would be great, and would put an end to a lot of debates. As I mentioned earlier, this model is specifically a reconstruction of Sue the T-Rex, and so to create it, the scientists at EoFauna very closely followed an incredibly detailed description of every single one of the bones in Sue's skeleton, so they could separate out and examine every individual bone. They also used a 3D digital skeleton of Sue published by the Field Museum as a reference, so the proportions of this model are very faithful to the individual quirks of Sue's anatomy. I should also mention that the Field Museum has its own life-size model of Sue on display, which is also very nice. I believe it's called Fleshy. This model also incorporates some of the injuries observed on Sue's skeleton into the life reconstruction, which is very cool. To be fair, this could also be another good contender for one of the most accurate T-Rex depictions we've seen so far. Perhaps I'll just do a video putting together all the strongest contenders at some point. The injuries on Sue's body is the one thing that I wish the EoFauna model would have also included. Sue did seem to have a pretty rough life and shows quite a few pathologies across the skeleton, so it would have been kinda cool to have that shown on the model. Anyway, one of the quirks of Sue's anatomy concerns her cranial ornamentation. Above and just beyond the orbit, where the eye would sit, T-Rexes in general have what's called a post-orbital horn, and then just above and in front of the orbit, it joins up with a lacrimal horn. In front of this, there's then a slight raised rugose ridge running down the top of the snout, either side of the fused nasals. Well, in most Tyrannosaurus individuals, there's a pronounced notch in between the postorbital and lacrimal horns. However, in Sue, this notch is absent, and the horns are a little bit more confluent. This is reflected in the EoFauna model, with only a very subtle notch between the postorbital and lacrimal horns. And though they are still distinct projections, they are joined quite closely compared to other T-Rexes. So you know this is definitely Sue. The distinct colours for the projecting horns are very nice as well. The nasal ridges running along the top of the snout also have a slight reddish-brown tint, reflecting the probable display function of these structures. I also want to applaud the lack of shrink wrapping on this model. This has been an issue with lots of older reconstructions of dinosaurs, and T-Rex in particular, where not enough soft tissue is put around the bones. It's often particularly obvious on the head, with a lot of reconstructions making the skull openings very clear from the outside. Well, this model is very chunky indeed, which is especially good considering that Sue is a particularly hefty individual, even for a T-Rex. Among the specimens of Tyrannosaurus that are known to science, there is quite a bit of variation, and one of those notable variations is how robust the skeletons are. There appear to have been distinct robust and gracile morphs of Tyrannosaurus, and Sue is one of the robust rexes. This variation, as well as some other differences, and the fact that Tyrannosaurus as a whole existed across a time span of a few million years, has inspired some paleontologists to propose that T-Rex should in fact be split into 3 different species. In this case, Sue would actually be called Tyrannosaurus imperator, but that's a long, complicated story, and I covered it in another video a few years ago. The point is that this model is nice and robust, and so it represents Sue's immense chunkiness very well. Interestingly, the EoFauna scientists also pointed out that the digital 3D model of Sue on the Field Museum site, which you can find and look at for free, has a few anatomical issues. Mostly it's alright, but certain parts are a bit off, such as the positioning of the pectoral girdle with the scapulae or shoulder blades being too far down the ribcage. In addition, the positioning of the belly ribs, called gastralia, is incorrect as well, giving this digital model the appearance of having a super deep chest region. So the EoFauna digital reconstructions, in which they started with the skeleton and then built upon it with musculature and then skin, correct these misplacements, giving us a better picture of Sue's proportions. Another of the interesting things that the EoFauna team discovered while working on this model is that the thickness of the tail you see in the reconstruction is likely near the maximum thickness that this part of the body could have been. Non-bird dinosaurs used a prominent tail muscle, called the caudofemoralis longus, as the main muscle to pull their hind limbs backwards and hence to walk. This is the same muscle that many modern reptiles use as well, and it can be easily seen in crocodilians. The muscle originates from a vertebra in the tail and attaches to a bony crest on the upper leg bone, the femur. So when the muscle contracts, the femur is pulled backwards. A 2010 study compared the size and anatomy of the caudofemoralis muscles of modern reptiles such as crocodiles to non-bird theropods, focusing on T-Rex itself. It argued that many reconstructions undersold the beefiness of the base of the tail, as we see a lot of bulging muscle in this region in living crocodilians. And since this is the primary locomotive muscle in T-Rex, it makes sense that it would have more mass. So since this publication, a lot of paleoartistic reconstructions have indeed given Tyrannosaurus and other non-bird theropods much more beefed up tail bases. However, the EoFauna team found that the thickness of the tail in their reconstruction could not be increased any further than what we see here, as it would cause the leg muscles themselves to bend out way too much. Although the tail isn't by any means particularly skinny, it is perhaps slightly more slender than I'm used to seeing with other modern Tyrannosaurus reconstructions. But there's obviously still a strong caudofemoralis muscle in there. So it's another interesting aspect of T-Rex anatomy that goes to show the value of creating scientifically rigorous reconstructions of extinct animals. Making models or any kind of paleoart challenges you to think about aspects of biology and life appearance that you might just never consider otherwise from just looking at the fossil remains. The benefits yielded from the interconnection of science and art are always very obvious in paleontology in particular, and the EoFauna Sue the T-Rex model is a perfect example of this. Every year, it seems we get closer and closer to having an authentic view of what the real Tyrannosaurus would have looked like. Even within my lifetime, and even just in the last decade or so, I've seen our understanding of T-Rex life appearance change and improve significantly, and I'm excited to see what the future holds too. So there we have it, the EoFauna Tyrannosaurus. I'll put a link in the description to EoFauna's website so you can buy your own very accurate T-Rex model. I'd like to say a big thank you to the EoFauna team for sending me this model and for answering my questions about their research. They really have made a fantastic reconstruction of Sue here, and it feels like I'm actually looking into the face of a long dead individual T-Rex, which is not something you get with every T-Rex reconstruction. EoFauna has made several other truly beautiful looking and very scientifically accurate models of prehistoric animals as well. including various extinct elephant relatives, Triceratops, Giganotosaurus, Diplodocus, and the adorably bizarre looking Atlasaurus. I would highly recommend checking these models out. The site will be linked below. Let me know if there are any other T-Rex depictions you'd like to see me review the accuracy of. I would really quite like to cover the prehistoric planet Tyrannosaurus. I think that would be quite fun. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next video, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.